the vengeful spirit of the daughter. The couple, Mr. and Mrs. Cam, were kind-hearted people in the ordinary sense. They worked diligently and with determination, back when they were still in their homeland. Both of them had made a firm resolution to find ways to escape from a life of hardship, struggle, and poverty. They came from families that had just enough to eat and wear, while they were not extremely poor, compared to the rich families they had only heard of and never seen. They were eager to achieve wealth and had never experienced a life of luxury and honor like the wealthy, prosperous people. Thus, this dream motivated them to always nurture and hold it in their hearts, encouraging each other to achieve it. They married during a time when the entire country was struggling with economic difficulties. Business was tough, and opportunities were scarce, making it hard to earn enough money to support their family and 2 children, let alone live comfortably and with dignity. They often found themselves in a constant state of financial hardship, with every endeavor seeming like a struggle to make ends meet. The hardship became unbearable, and Mr. Cam found himself stuck in the life of a soldier, a low-ranking officer, constantly on the move, under pressure, always worried about fulfilling his duties and obligations as a subordinate. He had learned to stay within his limits to avoid being sent to the front lines, where he might lose his position. While he didn't have to participate in the grueling marches and battles of the front, he still had to carry out 2 essential tasks. One was to supply military equipment to the units on the move. The other was to maintain good relations with powerful superiors, often through gifts, bribes, or even offering up young girls, daughters of the poor, to those in power. He spent money to indulge, buying girls or giving them away to higher-ups in order to secure his position, ensuring a comfortable life in the rear. This was something only Mr. Cam truly understood. Yet, Mrs. Cam turned a blind eye, allowing her husband to continue his actions and exploit the young girls, children of poor families. To accomplish this, Mr. Cam resorted to cutting corners, embezzling or stealing military supplies intended for combat units, taking them home to give to Mrs. Cam, who would then find ways to sell them. This was their way of achieving some semblance of wealth and status, as Mrs. Cam would show off to others and lead a somewhat luxurious, comfortable life. Mr. Cam also found peace, living contentedly with his wife and children, with the young girls always eager to get close, hoping to take advantage of his wealth. Mr. Cam knew this was wrong and recognized the indirect harm it caused to his comrades on the front lines, whose deaths were due in part to the inadequate supplies he had failed to provide. But he was indifferent, telling himself that the failures and deaths on the battlefield were not his fault but simply the fate of war. If the enemy can fight despite lacking supplies, it's because they are tougher than my comrades. The outcome of the battle doesn't concern me. He would reason, seeking to ease his conscience. As for the young girls, he did not force them to sell their bodies. It was merely a fair exchange. He argued, I give food in exchange for their service. If there are any consequences, they must deal with them themselves. I made it clear from the start, so they can't blame me. By justifying himself this way, Mr. Cam felt at ease and continued his exploitation of the girls, his petty thefts, and embezzlement to fulfill his duties as a supply officer. Thanks to this, he rose through the ranks and became a model soldier. His career advanced steadily with promotions and awards, and during his 12 years of service, he never had to fire a single shot. Eventually, when the situation worsened, like everyone else, his family had to flee, Thanks to his extensive network of connections, his family was able to escape early, boarding a ship before the chaos erupted. Avoiding the violent clashes and desperate scramble for safety, the family made it safely abroad, and once they arrived, they sighed in relief. Whenever they thought of the privileges they had received, they felt proud of their cleverness and resourcefulness in securing their escape. Despite arriving with nothing, their years of cunning and greed had finally borne fruit, though they now faced a completely unfamiliar life in a new country, with language barriers and strange daily routines. However, thanks to their cunning, intelligence, and the desire to succeed, they quickly adapted to the new land, known for its opportunity. Before long, Mr. and Mrs. Cam had become wealthy and successful, thriving in business ventures. They had access to all kinds of lucrative opportunities. The business initially started small but grew rapidly, consistently increasing their wealth. Money and profits flowed in like a raging river, never ceasing. With vast wealth, property, cars, conveniences, and a large workforce, including assistants, drivers, and helpers, they had everything under control. They were full of pride, constantly basking in their success and cleverness. With their new lifestyle, it seemed impossible that they would ever fall back into poverty again. They were confident that they would never experience the hardships of their earlier life. Their two grown children had transformed into well-groomed, successful individuals, adopting new behaviors, speech, and habits, distancing themselves from their humble origins. The family now enjoyed a life of modernity and sophistication, respecting absolute freedom and personal ideologies. As for Mr. Cam, he had become a wealthy man with extravagant tastes. Mrs. Cam, too, indulged in luxury, having an affair with her longtime driver, a strong, quiet man who drove a delivery truck. He had his own family and only met with Mrs. Cam when her husband was away or when she felt like it. They would secretly meet, and then return to their usual roles. There were times when the driver felt jealous, but he understood that staying silent was the best solution to preserve their relationship. Allowing the affair to continue, in this new country, success was measured by wealth, status, and power, a formula that everyone recognized. It was an undeniable truth, guiding their lives, making it hard for anyone to resist. The Cam family now found it difficult to escape the lure of wealth, no matter how much they wanted to stop, as their lives became increasingly consumed by materialism. Thus, their personal lives became busy, distant from each other. Their children, now grown, were caught up in the whirlwind of their own lives, rarely finding a moment of peace. They rarely had simple family meals or restful nights. The family was constantly preoccupied with business deals, social engagements, and the demands of their new life. Little time was left for relaxation, let alone for nurturing family relationships or personal well-being. The wealth increasingly grew abundant and prosperous, gradually becoming a binding custom, a routine that could not be interrupted or ceased. The time to live for each other also became more limited, restricted. He lived his life, and she lived hers. No one cared about the other. Business had flourished steadily, while the enjoyment of it all had become so mundane and excessive in America. Once, Mr. and Mrs. Cam decided to return to their homeland. Mrs. Cam eagerly awaited this opportunity. She used the excuse of staying in the U.S. to manage their business while he went away. Mr. Cam, with no suspicion, agreed quickly for her to stay behind in the U.S., while he returned to visit his homeland. There was nothing to question about his plans to go back to research and develop their business. However, He was secretly excited when he heard people who had traveled to Vietnam telling stories of pleasurable trips with young girls back home, spending very little money, as rumored by those who had previously traveled there. Upon arriving in his homeland, poor and run down, he stayed at an expensive hotel reserved only for powerful tourists. There, an intermediary showed him pictures of young, beautiful girls ready to exchange or sell their bodies. Mr. Cam immediately chose a photo of a beautiful, innocent-looking girl. He paid a small sum for her. His companion was a girl in her 20s, younger than both of his children back in the US. She calmly accepted the money, then asked the intermediary to pass it on to her mother, who was ill. She then surrendered her body to him. Once the period of exchange had ended, her mother came to the hotel to collect her daughter and take her home. At the management office, Mr. Cam showed a moment of kindness, personally escorting the girl to the last step. But he never expected that the girl's mother would be the one waiting for her, a woman he had once had a close affair with. He had taken her, then given her to his superior, only to cruelly abandon her while she carried his child. He had never shown any care for this woman, who was the biological mother of the girl he had just defiled. This was the same woman who, over 20 years ago, had shared a relationship with him, only for him to pass her on to another man because of his own responsibilities as a married man with children. This woman, with a small sum of money, had been left to find her own way to give birth. And now, the girl who had just exchanged her body with him was the biological daughter he had once abandoned. The events unfolded as if destined by fate, full of horror and injustice, leaving both adults involved with no words, only silent pain. The poor, young girl, both victim and witness of this twisted fate, felt overwhelming shame and sorrow. She broke free from her mother's grasp and ran out into the street. At that moment, a car came from nowhere, hitting her and taking her life. Mr. Cam was just as shocked. He stood there, dumbfounded, trying to regain his composure. Quickly, he left a sizable amount of money with the woman who had once been his lover to handle the funeral for the unfortunate girl. Then he hurriedly bought a plane ticket back to America earlier than planned, a full half-month ahead of schedule. When he arrived home late one night, his mind still reeling from the shocking events of his trip to Vietnam. But to his shock, he found another heart-wrenching sight. His wife was in the arms of the delivery driver, embracing him openly, believing he was still away. It was truly a calamity upon calamity. Mr. Cam quietly slipped out of the house, leaving the adulterous pair to their actions. Once again, he fled from a bitter reality. He quietly left home and found a hotel to stay in temporarily, waiting for the shocking events to subside. Then, he would deal with everything slowly. But from that moment on, his mind was a haze. Times confused, times calm. The strange, invisible force pushed him to carry out the reckless actions of a madman. Thoughts of hatred and regret constantly filled his mind, urging him to return home and eliminate the adulterous pair. He struggled to maintain control to avoid making further disastrous mistakes, and eventually, he fell asleep. The girl who had sold her virginity to him in Saigon appeared in his thoughts. In his exhausted, half-dreaming state, her delicate body appeared, sometimes shrouded in mist, sometimes exposed. He tried to close his eyes to drive the image away, but in his ears, he heard her cold voice. "You cannot escape the sins you have caused, reaching up to the heavens. You think no one knows. But now it is time for you to repay the debt of my life. Please forgive me for my sins. I was trapped in this with her entirely by accident. I didn't intend it." The ghost of the girl, killed by a car in Saigon, laughed ominously. Yes, you were accidental. But how many times have you used the power of money to take away the peace and purity of so many women and girls? Yet you are still not at peace, still continuing to carry out your sins. There is no heaven or earth that will forgive you. You have created so much karmic debt for yourself. And now the karma has come full circle, forcing you to destroy me, to destroy your own daughter, the one who carries your blood. The sins you committed over 20 years ago have come back to haunt you. Now, you must repay them with your own pain. As for your wife, I'm sure you found out when you returned home. You must kill her to avenge this betrayal. Do that first, and then proceed with the rest. After speaking, the ghost disappeared from the hotel room. Mr. Cam suddenly became a little more aware. The weather wasn't hot, but he was drenched in sweat. He looked around, and everything in the room was still. Suddenly, he felt as if there were strong winds in his ears. He only heard the howling and realized he had been transported to another chaotic world. Then, an invisible force urged him to jump up from his chair, rent a car, and speed back to the house where the two lovers were still indulging. He had no more composure to stand and witness their affair. With each stab of bitter hatred, he violently attacked the two of them until they no longer moved. Then he locked the door behind him and left. The next day, news outlets reported the death of a woman who owned an Asian import-export company, murdered alongside her lover, though he survived with serious injuries. The police found no evidence or clues about the killer, and the investigation continued, awaiting the funeral of the unfortunate victim. Only then did Mr. Cam return home in a strange, quiet mood, while the delivery driver lover was still being investigated. Gradually, the event faded into the past. No one spoke of it again. Mr. Cam appeared deeply sorrowful, neglecting food and sleep. He was like a man without a soul, no longer able to focus on his usual business activities. People mistakenly thought he was grieving the tragic death of his unfaithful wife, but no one knew the true reason. He was consumed with guilt and regret, especially for the death of his own daughter, whom he had destroyed, leaving her spirit lost in misery. His actions, his sins, had led to her tragic fate. The two children of Mr. and Mrs. Cam, though still young, lacked the experience to take over the complicated family business. Soon, the vast empire Mr. and Mrs. Cam had built was lost. Mr. Cam was placed in a mental hospital, hoping to cure his madness, as his mind had truly become unhinged. The tragic fall of Mr. Cam, once a successful refugee in America, left many people confused, not understanding the full story. They only sighed, regretful for the loss. Few understood that heaven is wise and compassionate. God had granted the Cam family wealth and good fortune, but after gaining everything so easily, people become arrogant, believing their success and cleverness are solely their own doing, without realizing they are the result of accumulated good fortune from past lives. Over time, they disregard morality, belittle others, and embrace their own desires and vices, ultimately bringing disastrous consequences upon themselves. When they finally realize the truth, it is too late. A life is wasted, a precious gift that could have been used to serve a higher purpose, granted by God after many lifetimes of spiritual cultivation. As time passed, the story of Mr. Cam faded from public attention. He became increasingly withdrawn, neglecting his meals and sleep, seemingly lost in his own thoughts. People assumed his sorrow was due to the tragic death of his unfaithful wife. But in reality, the true cause of his distress was the overwhelming guilt he felt for the death of his own daughter, the one he had betrayed. He had destroyed her, and now her spirit wandered, never to be at peace. The two children of Mr. and Mrs. Cam, though young, were incapable of taking over the family's complex business empire. Soon, the vast fortune the couple had built began to crumble, and Mr. Cam, in his broken state, was sent to a mental institution, hoping to find some cure for his madness. His tragic downfall, once a successful refugee in America, left many people confused. They did not understand the full story, only feeling sorry for him, unaware of the root cause. Few understood the deeper truth. Heaven is wise and compassionate. The Cam family had been granted wealth and success by divine grace. But after attaining everything so easily, people grow arrogant, believing their success is the result of their own brilliance, failing to recognize that it is the result of good fortune accumulated in previous lifetimes. As time passes, they lose sight of spiritual values, ridiculing others and embracing greed and vice, ultimately bringing destruction upon themselves. By the time they realize their mistake, it is too late. A life wasted, a gift that could have been used for something noble, granted by God after countless lifetimes of spiritual effort, is gone forever.